Help give kids an extra life by donating today to help sick and injured children. Link in the description and pinned comment below.
You know what they say, never buy a console on day one. How many of you did anyway?
Video games have taken many forms over the years, from radar dishes to arcade cabinets to plug-and-play units to wallet-destroying parasites on Steam. But ever since the Magnavox Odyssey in 1972, consoles and handheld systems have been the go-to. Even with the rise in PC gaming, consoles remain relevant because, well, not everyone can afford a gaming-quality PC. Probably because of how much high-end gaming PCs cost. Why do you think I've been sticking with my 2013-ass PC for this long? And hey, we got 2 brand new consoles this very month. Wait, scratch that, we got 3. So, with the PS5 and the Xbox Series X and Series S unleashed upon the world, things are about to get competitive all over again. But let's be real here. People typically don't buy a system for high-tech specs. They buy it for games. And while a launch doesn't necessarily determine the fate of a system, hello 3DS, having great titles on day one can only help a company move systems out the door and money from our hands into theirs. Now I'm taking into account the US launch for this, and I'm limiting things to 1 game per system. For the ranking, I'll be looking at how these titles represented the systems they launched for. So let's talk about some big first impressions. It's game time! I honestly feel kinda sorry for the Sega Saturn. I feel that if it wasn't for the breakdown between Sega Japan and Sega America, I feel like it could have lasted longer against the rising PlayStation in the US. But instead of going on about how Sega blew an opportunity, let's actually talk about the potential that it did have. And what better way to show off your fancy new 32-bit hardware than putting your revolutionary new fighting game on it? Granted, we had Virtua Fighter on the 32X already, but who actually owned that piece of crap in the first place? This wasn't Sega's first attempt at a 3D fighter, that was Dark Edge in 1992, but it was the first one to really catch on. By today's standards, this is Unga Bunga caveman levels of primitive, and even the franchise itself grew by leaps and bounds, but back in the day, this was a big friggin' deal. Those polygonal fighters were capable of quite a lot with just 3 buttons and a stick. Another thing that Virtua Fighter attempted to do was ground its gameplay style in more realistic martial arts, instead of the fantastical stuff like key techniques that Street Fighter was known for. The result was full contact fury that would inspire games like the current king of the 3D ring, that being Tekken. I'm putting this one as low as it is because the initial release of the Saturn version did have some issues that were addressed with a remix version that was given out for free to registered owners of the system. But still, this was a gateway to the future of 3D fighting games. A future that it's only now re-entering after a long absence. So are we getting a remix of an old game or a completely new one? Guess we'll find out soon one way or the other.
It's Ridge Racer! Ridge!
Okay.
You know, for as supremely dominant as the PS1 was during its generation, its best system sellers didn't start coming out until a few months after it launched. That being said, of the games that Sony's original powerhouse did put out on day one, the one that best showed off its superior and less expensive hardware was the one that would inspire derisive memes more than 10 years later. Ridge Racer was Namco's answer to Daytona in the arcades and on home platforms alike. But looking at it for its time, those graphics were great. The concept is simple enough, I mean it is a racing game, and while the game's options are limited, it still manages to give a solid drift racing experience. Funny enough, the arcade version of the game was developed in 8 months, so that they could compete with the other company. I'm guessing they were referring to Sega. And they had to build the PlayStation version from the ground up in just around the same amount of time. Given the positive critical reception the game received, I'd say things worked out. This was the earliest system seller for the PS1, and helped get Sony's foot in the door after Nintendo slammed it in their faces 3 years earlier. I still wonder what the game industry would look like today if that deal didn't fall through. Fun fact, on the loading screen you can play Galaxian, and even unlock more cars by getting a perfect. I still need to get to covering that game. Speaking of PlayStation, let's talk about the PS2 for a moment, huh? This is the highest selling console of all time, with over 155 million units sold, over 12 years in production, and over 3,800 games made for the thing. To call this beast dominant would be a complete understatement. And think about its launch. Full backward compatibility, a built-in DVD player, enhanced processing power, a mediocre launch lineup. Well, at least they had Tekken. Once again, getting some help from Namco, Tekken Tag Tournament was one of the first games that Sony showed off for their then newly revealed successor. And hey, Tekken worked really well on the PS1, so why not use it as a launch title? Heck, the mechanics of Tekken 3 worked pretty well for what Namco had in mind. A who's who of the series thus far making up the roster, the eponymous tag system making for new strategies and gameplay possibilities, and of course that good-ass Tekken you know and love. And the PS2 has some extra bells and whistles. An updated engine similar to the one that Tekken 4 would later use, updated graphics and backgrounds, updated music, and rebalanced moves, along with a one-on-one mode for those who want a more traditional fight, and a team battle consisting of teams of up to 8 fighters. Whew, that's a lot to take in. But of course, let's not forget the one thing that made this arcade port worth owning. That's right, I'm talking about the one and only Tekken Bowl. Fans loved this mode so much that they brought it back for Tekken 7. So let me get this straight. I can play bowling on my DVD player? No wonder this system sold like a legend. To say that the reveal of the Xbox One was a disaster is putting it lightly.
TV and movies? TV. Xbox. Watch TV. 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 TV.
And that was just the beginning. Mandatory Connect, DRM up the wazoo, an original plan of locking a game to its original owner? All of which were eventually rolled back. Jeez, how do you salvage something from that?
Coming to your home in 2013, all on Xbox One!
Okay, that's something. You know how Rare wasn't doing so hot under Microsoft? Well, after the horrible press Xbox One was getting, Microsoft needed something to get people on board, and they decided at E3 that year to announce that they were bringing back one of Rare's classic franchises. And damn did the reveal of Killer Instinct look good. Classic characters sporting updated HD looks and sharper moves, new meter mechanics to make the series' signature combos even flashier, and to be perfectly honest, Killer Instinct is still one of the most newcomer-friendly fighting games around, with one of the best and most in-depth tutorials I've seen, that not only introduces players to the game's mechanics, but also to some of the fundamentals of fighting games in general. Combo breakers were also easier to pull off, ultra combos were easier to understand and more stylish, and everything just had a great flow to it. And yet it's lower on the list because it took quite a while to get it to the point where it is today. The game now has a total of 29 characters, but they were gradually released over the course of 3+ seasons. The first season only had 9. However, the game did manage to grow at a steady pace despite changing developers after Season 1, ultimately having 3 different single-player campaigns and excellent rollback netcode. Also, Mick Gordon's soundtrack kicks ass, don't deny it. The Dreamcast, Sega's last gasp at console greatness. After the failure of the Saturn, Sega was pinning their hopes on this console, and they went in hard to market this thing in America. $99.99 for $199! $9! So, how did the launch go? Well, not much, only selling over 225,000 units on the first day! Well, Sega did want this console to go fast. Yeah, I know, low-hanging fruit, shut up. Okay, I'll be the first to admit that the aging of Sonic's first full main series foray into 3D is, for lack of a better word, divisive. But who better to headline Sega's final console crusade than its headline hedgehog? Especially after his Soul Saturn spin-off has long been relegated to internet meme purgatory. But when you consider what games in 1999 were like, yeah, Sonic Adventure was a huge deal. 6 intersecting stories with unique gameplay styles, full voice acting, and for the time, the graphics were really something else. Not to mention, I personally had a lot of fun exploring that expansive hub world. Also, oh yeah, that banger of a soundtrack. My guess is that for a lot of people, this was their first exposure to the legendary Crush 40. God, I love those guys. Thing is, I'll be the first to say that certain parts of the game do not hold up. I mean, the big stages are a big thumbs down from me, and I have no idea why they thought to give him a boss fight, and I'm not exactly Indiana Jonesing for Knuckles' Emerald hunts. But I had a blast with Sonic's high-octane speedfests, Tails and his race stages, and going Rambo with Gamma while experiencing his sad story. So, was it worth it? Yeah, I'd say so. Granted, I can't for the life of me understand how subsequent remakes actually made the game worse, but the original gave Sega some much-needed hope for their...
Oh no!
Real talk for a moment, when it comes to launches, Nintendo is a textbook case of feast or famine. When they've fallen short on a launch, it almost has never boded well for the system's outlook. I shudder to think what would have happened to the 3DS if Nintendo didn't go into panic mode. But when Nintendo nails it, they freaking nail it. Typically, the difference is that one killer app that just screams, "Buy me." Funny how sometimes that killer app isn't even planned for your new hardware. Yeah, both times Zelda was a launch title for a console, they started out being developed on the one before it. Just like Twilight Princess started development on the GameCube but found its way into the Wii's launch lineup, Breath of the Wild was originally planned for the big exclusive that was sure to finally get the Wii U selling. Then delays kept happening, and the Switch's development was galloping along, and Nintendo figured, screw it. Let's cut our losses with the Wii U, and put this game on our new hybrid system as well. That'll get people interested in it. And that's what happened. Breath of the Wild was both the Requiem for the Wii U, and the Overture for the Switch. And given that the Switch shipped over 3 million units in its first month, and over 2.7 million copies of the game, I think we can safely say it worked. And Breath of the Wild had plenty of new ideas for the franchise on its own. Expansive open world where you can go pretty much anywhere you can see, non-linear progression, lots of ways to test your mettle, tons of lore to go around. This was a new kind of Zelda title. Granted, not everything hit the mark. I could have really done without the weapon durability, and the whole stamina meter thing wasn't quite my cup of tea, but it's still highly regarded among most Zelda fans as one of the best games in the series, and I doubt the Switch would be in nearly as good a position that it is without this game. Heck, we even have a canon Hyrule Warriors game that's a prequel, and the sequel featuring Mummy Ganondorf still in the pipe, so who even needs Skyrim anymore? I certainly ain't giving Todd Howard my money. Back in 1999, when Sony first announced the PS2, everyone knew that it was going to be big. And the last company you'd think to see this as a threat was Microsoft. But seeing that Sony was positioning their impending Goliath as a multimedia console, the House of Windows was getting worried that people wouldn't want PCs anymore. In retrospect, that fear turned out to be unfounded, but PC gaming back then wasn't even close to what we have today. So Microsoft decided to enter the console market themselves with the original Xbox. And the face of the console would be hidden behind a Space Marine's helmet. The importance of Halo to Microsoft's budding console business cannot be understated. If the world's introduction to the saga of Master Chief and his battles against the Covenant hadn't caught on, the gaming landscape might not look the way it does today. But Halo managed to get people's attention by living up to its Combat Evolved subtitle. Sometimes evolution is just as effective as revolution. And Bungie Studios took what was originally planned to be an RTS for computers, and as ideas were proposed and accepted or scrapped, eventually turned it into an FPS that drew upon and expanded on the concepts that made previous hits in the genre work. While games like GoldenEye and Perfect Dark on the N64 proved that FPS games could work on consoles, Halo proved that the genre could thrive on them. And it did so in a way that made its single-player campaign and its multiplayer battles feel unique and both worth playing. Heck, people would have LAN parties with their Xboxes to play 16-player multiplayer. This was before Xbox Live was even a thing. Halo even inspired creativity outside of video games. Anyone who's a fan of machinima can attest to that, thanks to Red vs. Blue. Other attempts at mascots for the Xbox came and went, but when people think of Xbox, more often than not, Halo is the game that comes to mind. Which makes it no surprise that Halo Infinite is looking to be a big deal on Microsoft's new generation platforms. And I'm convinced it would have been a launch title were it not for this damn pandemic. Guess even Space Marines aren't immune to viruses. You know how Nintendo has focused more on innovation over making a more powerful console the last few generations? Well, after getting curb-stomped by Sony twice in a row, Nintendo needed a new approach because something clearly was not working. To that end, newly appointed company president Satoru Iwata, God rest his soul, decided to focus more on broadening the gaming demographic. With the Wii, one of his requirements was, a mom has to like it. Well, I don't know how many moms like Zelda, but they had something else in mind for those people. Hey, pack-in games are launch titles too, and when your system comes bundled with a game that is tailor-made to show off your fancy new motion controls, then I can't think of a better way to market your system. Except maybe two guys rolling up in a smart car to Japanese music, but hey, that ad campaign was genius. Wii Sports was a gateway to a new market of gamers, the casual crowd. People were getting together and bonding over baseball, golf, boxing, tennis, and especially bowling. I personally remember having so much fun with bowling. This was essentially a public demo of how motion controls could work with this new system, making for a more active and immersive experience than just pushing buttons on a controller. It actually felt like you were playing the actual sports to a certain degree. Some people have actually used it for exercise, and it's even been used for physical therapy, including for stroke victims and injured soldiers. Granted, exercise is why Nintendo made Wii Fit later on, but you get the idea. Wii Sports also introduced the in-game integration of the now iconic avatars called Miis, so people could put themselves in the game or whatever kind of people they could come up with. Wii Sports introduced a whole new sector of gaming, becoming a focal point of family gatherings, retirement home events, and college parties worldwide. As a result, Wii systems flew off shelves to the point where stores couldn't keep up with the incredible demand, and Nintendo, despite having the inferior specs, came out of the 7th generation with the superior sales numbers. So yeah, moms did like it, as did dads, uncles, grandmas, college roommates, cousins. While Nintendo's consoles have been decidedly hit or miss in virtually equal measures, they have the handheld gaming market on virtual lockdown since 1989. And it all started with a big gray brick with a green dot matrix screen, a library of over 1,000 titles, and future redesigns that just made the experience better. It changed portable gaming forever, and considering that portable gaming to that point had just been dominated by single-game LCD units, that can only be considered an improvement. And what better way to appeal to the masses than a game as simple to play and hard to screw up as Tetris? We all know what the game is by now: drop blocks, make lines, watch them vanish, score points. Yeah, I've talked about the arcade games already. Yeah, shameless plug for my arcade videos because the YouTube algorithm hates my guts. Even back then it was fun, it was addictive, and people straight up loved it. Granted, the Game Boy version was almost exactly like the NES version gameplay-wise, but all those fancy variants didn't exist yet anyway. Of course, on a monochrome screen, it was important to make each piece stand out, so having different textures worked more than well enough. Also, unlike the NES version, there was the iconic Versus mode, complete with garbage, so that link cable thing had a use right off the bat. Tetris served to introduce a lot of players to portable gaming and show just how well it could work. And it did so with a game that pretty much everyone could simply just pick up and play. Having it as the pack-in game was a genius move, and helped launch the Game Boy into prominence on day one, making Nintendo a dominating force in handheld gaming. Selling over 1 million units by the end of your first year? Yeah, that's a freaking statement. Even Alexei Pajitnov himself said that this version of Tetris was his favorite, and the most faithful to his original game. And even after more than 1,000 games for the Game Boy, it's still Tetris that's considered the system's true killer app. So, when Nintendo released the updated and more powerful Game Boy Color, what do you think they relied on to help sell this new version? Tetris. Seriously, the game is freaking everywhere nowadays. But I can't help but wonder how much the popularity of the Game Boy version had to do with that. Guess I'll never know. Now before we move on, here are a few honorable mentions. Castlevania Circle of the Moon for the Game Boy Advance, King of Fighters R2 for Neo Geo Pocket Color, Luigi's Mansion for GameCube, Super Mario World for Super NES, and Super Mario 64 for Nintendo 64. And now let's see what other people thought with this month's patron picks.
Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed. I found out about this through another Let's Player, and it was one of the only reasons that I even wanted to get the Wii U at the time.
Super Mario Advance for the Game Boy Advance is a really solid launch title as a Mario 2 remake.
The year was 1985. Nintendo's Famicom was a hot seller in Japan after a slow launch due to a faulty chipset which prompted a recall. And now they had their sights set on North America. The problem? The region was in the midst of the infamous crash of '83, brought on by oversaturation, lack of quality control, and other factors. It took quite a bit of effort to even get the thing onto shelves, from the naming conventions to the redesign, to calling it the Nintendo Entertainment System, to marketing it with peripherals like the Zapper and Rob. But there was one game in particular that helped get systems off the shelves. You may ask yourself, did he really just pick the most obvious choice? Well, would you rather that I subvert expectations just for the sake of it, or would you rather I tell it like it is? Well, I'll tell you one thing, Super Mario Bros. And the NES are synonymous with the revival of the industry, at least as far as America is concerned. If it wasn't for this game, video games may well have become a footnote in America's culture. Taking the side-scrolling platformer, a genre that continues to flourish to this day, and bringing it to the forefront thanks to its tight controls and exemplary level design, with World 1-1 still considered a textbook example of how to design an opening level. The now iconic power-ups like mushrooms, fire flowers, and stars. The snappy soundtrack that helped make music an important part of game design by having tracks accompany the different types of levels. To be able to design a game that did so much right within the limits of third-gen hardware was no easy task. But Nintendo pulled it off, and the game helped Nintendo become almost as closely associated with video games as Atari, as the NES flew off store shelves. Not to mention, it took Mario, who had already found success in the arcade with Donkey Kong and the original Mario Bros., and made him a superstar in popular culture. Even to this day, Mario is considered to be one of the faces of video games, and even with all the games his mustache sells on every Nintendo system, the game that launched him into prominence is still officially distributed and still sells well even today. Really, this was a launch title in more ways than one. It launched the NES in America, and it helped launch video games out of recession and back into the American consciousness. Not bad, Plumber Boy. Not bad.
To be honest, it's pretty telling just how much staying power Mario has for Nintendo. In fact, I could have easily included Super Mario World for the Super NES for what it brought to the series, or Super Mario 64 for what it did for 3D platforming on this list, and it still probably would have been pretty accurate. In fact, if I had a nickel for every time Mario had a launch title that didn't help sell the system it was on, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's kinda sad that it's happened twice, right? I'm the Quarter Guy, and until next time, the arcade is closed.
Okay, there's been a bit of a debate about what makes a Christmas movie. Take It's a Wonderful Life. Most of it doesn't take place during Christmas at all, and a lot of it has absolutely nothing to do with Christmas. Then there's movies that you'd think wouldn't be Christmas movies, but somehow are. So would a game based on a Christmas movie franchise be a Christmas game? Ah, what the hell. Yippee-ki-yay, Mother Hubbard! Next time, QG at the arcade. Die Hard Arcade. It's game time!